Hey guys, so I recently had a question and it was on one of my COVID videos where I was kind of explaining like my whole long process of testing positive for COVID and then my boss requesting me to show proof of a negative COVID test before she would let me return to work and kind of all of the issues surrounding that whole process. And so the question was about like when you should test for COVID after you have tested positive. And so I did look on the CDC's website just to kind of verify some of the information that I'm about to show you. I literally have the CDC website pulled up on my phone right now. And this talks about like when you should get tested. And so on their website, you can actually find all of this information that I'm about to tell you, unless they change it between now and when I upload it. So it has this thing on their website where it gives you scenarios to determine when you need to test. So actually, if you have had COVID in the last 90 days and have recovered from your symptoms, you don't need to be tested again unless you develop brand new symptoms that you didn't have. And if you do develop those symptoms, then you need to isolate immediately and get tested. And continue to stay home until you know the results and wear a well-fitted mask around others. So other than that, if any of the following apply to you, this is when you need to get tested. If you have COVID-19 symptoms, again, I will reiterate, this is not if you have tested positive in the past 90 days, unless you have new symptoms that you didn't have previously. So if you have COVID-19 symptoms, other than what I just said, get tested immediately and follow the quarantine guidance while waiting for the results. If not, then go to step 2. Step 2 is, have you had close contact exposure to someone with COVID? Yes, get tested at least 5 days after you have been exposed. Follow the quarantine guidance. If that doesn't apply to you, see step 3. Do you need to be tested for travel? And these kind of changed. I don't know if they have updated these, but I know like certain going outside of the United States and coming into the United States, things have changed recently and they seem to kind of be updating this guidance. So I'm not going to read these, but sometimes you might need to test for travel, just depending on like whatever means of travel you have. Certain companies may have stricter stricter requirements for you to show test results or show proof of vaccination and things like that. So just be wary of those requirements before you try to travel. Get tested after your travel if your trip involves situations with a greater risk of exposure, such as being in crowded places while not wearing a well-fitting mask or respirator. And it says, note that cruise travel has specific guidance on its own. And then there is also specific screening programs required and or recommended by work and or schools. So that is also something that you should be wary of. But so after the positive test is when you need to isolate. So obviously in my situation, this was not even recommended by the CDC when my boss told me that I needed to show proof of a negative test. I kind of talked about this in a couple of my videos talking about my experience with COVID. But according to the CDC said that a boss should not require employees to provide proof of a negative test or a doctor's note in order to return to work after having had COVID, as long as the person was asymptomatic and did not have a fever and wore a well-fitting mask. So that is what the CDC said. The health department in my local area also said that there would be no reason why my boss should have had me provide proof of a negative test in order to return to work, because as long as you wear a well-fitting mask and like I said, you're asymptomatic and you don't have a fever, then you should be fine. While I don't necessarily agree with that whole thing, I do think that 14 days, because it was exactly 14 days from the day that I tested positive, from the day that I started having symptoms, because my first initial test on the day that I started having COVID symptoms turned out to be negative. But 2 days later, I had a positive test. And so it was not 14 days from the date of the positive test. It was 14 days from the date that I started exhibiting symptoms of COVID that I actually finally tested negative from COVID. So just to give you guys a little bit of that information, if you didn't fully watch all those videos talking about like my experience with COVID and things like that, your employer should not have that requirement unless, like, obviously with like healthcare, maybe they're different. It kind of depends on the facility with that as well though, because a lot of places where I was working during COVID, if you had COVID, they would have you isolate for a short time. Once you were asymptomatic again, they would have you work one-on-one or like in close contact with actual COVID patients instead of with patients that didn't have COVID if they had the COVID units. So on this is a medical COVID article from MIT, and it says, if I don't have symptoms, why won't you do a second test to confirm that the first was not a false positive? And this kind of gives the information. Public health authorities consider a positive PCR test to be a true positive, so a subsequent negative test would not change the requirement for isolation. Research has shown that infected individuals may be asymptomatic but still able to spread the virus. Then there's another question on here. It says, I've tested positive for COVID-19 infection. How soon do I need to be tested again? So this kind of reiterates the information that I just told you guys. Once you've tested positive for the virus, you do not need to be tested again for 90 days from symptom onset. If you became ill, or from the date of your positive test if you remained asymptomatic. However, if you develop symptoms of COVID-19 during that 3-month period, and if clinicians cannot identify another cause for these symptoms, you may need to be retested at that time. So really, unless you have new symptoms or, suddenly you have something else going on or it's becoming more severe than it was previously, then you may be asked to take another test, or it may be wise for you to take another test if you had COVID and you had symptoms and then recovered from it, like I did. I wouldn't have had to test for another 90 days, but I sat here and I wasted all these at-home tests. Now, obviously, at-home tests are a little bit different from PCR tests. If you want more specific information on that, I can also provide another video giving you guys more information about the differences between a PCR test and an at-home rapid test. So if you guys are curious about that, please let me know. I'd be glad to share that information with you. I hope this answers the question for the person who asked. I am sorry that I will not get this up within a short amount of time after you ask the question, but I still feel like it's important to share this information because I'm sure there are other people who have the same sorts of questions. So just to kind of reiterate, you do not need to test for COVID. If you have tested positive, you do not need to test again for COVID. If you have had it and recovered from it within the last 90 days and you are asymptomatic, if you have new symptoms, new COVID symptoms, they may ask you to retest again if they cannot figure out where these symptoms are coming from, or if your symptoms that you have that may be lingering from your original COVID infection, if they are starting to get worse, then they may ask you to retest again. I would not go out there and buy up a whole bunch of at-home rapid tests or go out and spend a whole bunch of money getting tested unless that's something that you really want to do. I feel like that's kind of wasteful, and it's really not necessary because, like I said, the health department had told me you can continue to test positive for COVID for up to 90 days or sometimes even potentially longer than that, depending on how severe your case of COVID was. So just kind of keep that in mind. Try not to freak out about it. There are sometimes lingering symptoms from COVID that, obviously lingering means they continue to stay around. So just kind of be wary of that. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have a reinfection, but reinfection from COVID is definitely possible. So just, try not to stress yourself out too much about it. And just, if you are really worried about it, contact your primary care provider and let them know what your concerns are, and maybe they can help you kind of work through those things or deal with your symptoms in a better way. So I hope that answers your questions. If you guys have any other questions you'd like to ask me, any topics you'd like me to talk about in the future on my channel, please let me know and I'd be glad to get something filmed for you. And with that being said, I will talk to you guys next time.